Okay, we have a couple more topics. This next one is actually a really big piece of programming in general. It's called functions, specifically our own functions. We want to make our own functions. Sometimes you'll hear it called user-defined functions. These are the basic building blocks of your program. So, for example, if you're whether you want to admit it or not, maybe you didn't, but most of you probably played with Legos. You build big structures out of Legos, and you have different shaped Legos that fit together. And then once you fit them together, you can make these grand structures. And of course, if you spend a lot of money, you can build things like the Millennium Falcon or Hogwarts. My point is that you're given those various blocks and pieces. Well, Python has a lot of those things in there, like min, max, string, int, float. But sometimes we want to write our own things. Specifically, we want to do that when we want to reuse them over and over again. We want to have our own building blocks for writing things so that we can reuse them multiple times. It's less prone to errors, centralizes our stuff, allows us to reuse it in other programs. So there's a lot of good reasons for writing functions, and a lot of coding is writing functions. It's like literally the basis of writing code. And so I want to do a conversion from two different types of measurements of units. And then I'm going to do miles to kilometers. So 1 mile is approximately 1.609 kilometers. And 1 kilometer is 1 over 1.609 miles. And I don't know what that number is, but it's easy enough to figure out. And so I want to do a conversion, right? I want to take it as something as input and turn it into output. Specifically, though, I want to calculate the number of miles given a particular kilometer. So I'm going to input some kilometers, and I'm going to get some output of miles. So 5K run. I don't know how many miles that is. And since I'm actually a United States person here who barely understands kilometers, I'm going to want a program to help me convert kilometers to miles so I understand how long it really is. And so I want to write a function. You could think of functions as little black boxes. It's a mystery how these things work, right? And I'm going to write kilometer to miles. By the way, yesterday I talked about camel case, and then we're doing some reading about style in Java. In most Java stuff, the style is to actually use underscores. I don't know why. So I'm going to try and stick with that style because that's what you'll read on the Java documentation and other places. But sometimes you might see me skip the camel case. But for now, I'm just going to separate words with underscores. So I'm going to take in as input kilometers. Some magic is going to happen. I'm going to get some output. It's kind of like going to a restaurant, ordering a pizza. Some magic happens, and you give them money, they give you pizza. And I need a little bit extra room here because I have to write something else in here. The input in a function definition, which we're going to look in a second, is called a parameter. There are arguments when you call the function, but inside the function, they're called parameters. And the output is called a return value. So we have some parameters, we do some magic inside of our function. And then we do return some value, and then we can take that value and do some fun stuff. And there's a particular structure to a Python program. And there's some things called keywords. Keywords are things that you cannot name your variables or other things like them because they're already part of the language. So def stands for define. Then I give it my function name, kilometer to miles. However, all functions need parentheses. And this is where I list my parameters. And I'm going to take in some kilometers, but I'm going to call it distance in kilometers. I have a single input value, a single parameter. And whatever value comes in is going to be assigned into that parameter. And then there's this colon at the end. We'll talk more about the colon in a second. And then there's going to be some indenting that's going to happen. And then I want to do a new variable called dist miles. This is going to be my calculation to convert things. And all we have to do to convert is take our parameter, which works very much like a variable, and just divide it by 1.609. Finally, I have to get some output, which is another keyword called return. And I want to return my variable dist miles, which has our result of our calculation, our conversion. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. So definition, def, and return are keywords in Python. They're already part of the language. And so what we're doing here is we're defining a function. So that's why we use def, define a function. We're telling Python, I'm making a brand new function. And then the return statement is saying, I have this value, this number, in this particular case, it's a number. You could also do strings and other things as return values. But I'm saying I have this number that's stored in the dist miles variable, and I'm going to return that to the caller. And it's going to return something. So it's going to return some expression or a variable. So that's what these two things are, right? Those are keywords. And this thing here, this is just the name of the function. Right, that's the name. We're going to use that name to reference it, to call it like we did at int, float, or input. And here's the input parameter. And like I said, they're treated as variables inside the function. Also needed, and I kind of glossed over it, but those colons at the end, the colon at the end of the line for the function, for the def line, basically says the function definition, the header of the function definition ends here. And so that's the very first line that has to happen. And if you imagine that this is the left-hand side of your editor, you'll notice that this code here, which by the way is called the body of the function, that's the body of the function, does some stuff. In this case, it did a calculation and it returned a value. That's just the body of the function. But you'll notice that it's indented. And the indentation of each line in there means it's part of the body. The minute it sees a line that's indented differently, it's no longer part of the body of the function. For those of you who know Java, this is literally going to be the most confusing thing you have to deal with, because in Java, C++, C, almost every other programming language I've ever used, actually every other programming language I've ever used, you have some kind of curly brace or some marker saying begin function, end of function body. Here, it's all about the indentation. And it's usually 4 spaces. It could be 2, but 2 is a little hard to read in the editor, so use 4 because it's a little easier to use. So that's our function. And now we can actually code this up. So let's create a new file. And just put that code in there, kilometer to miles. That's the name. It takes dist underscore kilometer. That's our parameter. And then the colon. And thankfully, when I hit enter, it's already indented for me. The editor knows that you're creating a function and it provides the indentation for you. Distance miles. It's just a calculation into a variable here. So I take my kilometer, I treat it like a variable. and divide it by the number 1.609, the floating point number, which by the way means dist miles is a floating point number. And then I'm going to return dist miles. And notice how it color coded. And it knew the return statement was the end of the function, because that actually is how you end a function, is return usually. You can also write functions that don't return things, in which case you wouldn't need the return statement. But now it moved my cursor over. And so we have this function. And yes, you can actually see in here, if I go to the front of the line, there's 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's all about the indentation to define the body of that function. And let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to save this into my folder. Yeah, it's actually all backwards, so that didn't help. That was almost longer than not doing it. Lecture 3, and we're going to call this distance conversion. So now I have a function saved in a file, and I can run this. And it ran it, but it didn't do anything. There's no print statements. But what it did do is it actually loaded that function into Python. So I can use it, just like I can use min, right? Min is a function with 2 parameters, or in this case, 2 arguments that got copied into parameters. And now I can call kilometer to miles. Let's put it with 1 mile. And it did the conversion. Call it again. Let's do a 5 kilometer. How is it about running a 5K? Well, that's 3.1 miles. 2 miles. Let's run a 10K marathon, mini marathon. That's 6.1 miles. What about an actual marathon? This isn't going to be exact, but an actual marathon is like 42.1 something kilometers, but I'm just going to use 42. So 26.1, again, approximate. We could have also saved that into a variable. Then we could print that out, marathon distance miles. And now we have a function that we can use. Now, we're not done with this example yet. I'm going to come back and we're going to finish this. But right now, we've basically looked at how to create your own function. Again, these are kind of like the building blocks of your program. It allows us to make larger programs. Because you imagine if you wanted to put this in your program like 15 times, but you didn't use a function, you wrote the same calculation 15 times, and then you made a mistake and you had to go fix it 15 times. So functions are very, very handy, very, very helpful.